Thank you all for coming to the second half of today's replication panel. We have 5 new speakers for this afternoon session, and I'm just gonna briefly introduce them before they introduce themselves. So first, we have Alexandra Carstensen and Shilaan Alzahawi, both from Stanford University, California. Savannah Lewis from Ashland University in Ohio. Hansika Kapoor from Monk Pragyoshala Research Institute in India. And Eduardo Garcia-Garzon from Camilo José Cela University in Spain. So before we begin our roundtable discussion, I would just like to ask panelists to introduce themselves, give a little bit of background into their own kind of research career, and then also maybe mention some of the topics of the multi-country replications that they've worked on, their personal role in the studies, and the number of countries and collaborations that were involved in those studies before we begin. So yeah, we could start with Savannah, if you don't mind.
Sounds great. Like she said, I'm Savannah. I'm from Ashland University. So I only have a bachelor's degree, but currently I work at the Psychological Science Accelerator and am a researcher for Ashland University as the assistant director of our lab. So I work with Christopher Chartier, which some of you may know. I have done a lot of different types of research. I don't really have like a specific area of research because I just like research as its own aspect. And so some of the studies I have done that are multicultural and multi-country have been from face perception to cognitive reappraisal, stereotype threat, and a whole bunch of other kinds. So most of mine have been done with the Psychological Science Accelerator. Yeah, so the one that I'm going to focus the most on, because I've done so many, will be our most like recent and our first study, because they're very different in the way that they were done. So our first study was face perception based, and so that study actually had 11,000 participants in over 41 countries. And then our most recent one is our COVID rapid study, which worked on cognitive reappraisal. And that one had 21,000 participants in 87 countries. Yes, I think I forgot my roles. I've done a whole bunch of different roles, from just leading my lab at Ashland to working on back translating, checking video procedures that other labs send in, implementation of the actual study onto Form R, to just helping with project monitoring. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thanks so much. Hansika, would you go next?
Sure, Shaakya. So my name is Hansika Kapoor. I am based in Mumbai, India, and I am a research author at the Department of Psychology at a not-for-profit academic research organization called Monk Pragyoshala. In terms of, say, the variety of multi-country studies we've been involved in, it's kind of just been 2 to 3, but they've been on the topics of meta norms. That was one of them, where we collected data. I mean, we were part of data collection efforts from 57 countries and 22,000 participants. We were part of the Many Labs initiative on social and moral psychology as well, which I believe was 67 countries and quite a voluminous set of participants, I think 440,000 or something. But and then earlier on in our career, I think we assisted with data collection for, say, a cross-country collaboration on economic games, public goods games, and trust games, and to just understand how people in India, Indian students really respond to those economic games. And in terms of roles, I think so I personally have been involved in helping get ethics clearance so that those studies and replications can occur with Indian participants, as well as data collection efforts, project monitoring, if any back translations are required, and just overall coordination, and then seeing the manuscript through till, well, publication, in terms of at least reading over drafts and helping write that, etc.
Great, thanks so much. We already have quite a range of experience and expertise. Eduardo, would you mind going next?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the JRP for the invitation to this panel. As a disclaimer, I've been involved in the JRP since 2013, but right now I have much more like an advisory, like some kind of senior, but in the background role. I don't do much right now, so I'm happy for the invitation to be here today in this conference. Yeah, my name is Eduardo. I am at Universidad Francisco de Vitoria in Madrid. And basically, my main area of research is psychometrics, which is kind of weird given the other backgrounds of the other panelists. The reason I think I'm here is also because I've been involved, apart from my research in more like psychometrics and statistics, I've been involved in a couple of these multi-country large-scale replications. Last year, I was part of the team collecting data for the paper that the JRP Consortium published in the Nature Human Behavior journal. My largest role so far in this kind of project has been in this year project, which is about temporal discounting. We are currently finishing the project right now. It's about 60 countries, 13,000 people involved. And my role, as you might have hinted for my background, is to make sure that stats, modeling, and all that kind of stuff is okay. So it's true that I've been taking part of data collection, preparing the experiments, preparing like the setup, but I have also been responsible for make sure that power analysis, stats, and that we are sure that everything that the data is correctly analyzed. So thank you all for the invitation. I'm really looking forward for the panel.
Great, thanks a lot. Alex, would you mind going next, please?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Alex Carstensen. My background is in language and thought research. So my PhD was looking at whether speakers of different languages think differently in line with their languages or think independent of their languages, which means that most of the cross-country work I've contributed to and worked on has been pretty close comparisons, usually of 2 or 3 countries at a time. More recently, I've been involved with some larger multi-country comparisons, looking at development and some assumptions about what parts of human development might be universal and which ones might be more variable. So in particular, I've been involved with a project of the Mini Babies Consortium, which leads these multi-country replications. The goal of the one I've been involved with is to get more countries involved in Africa and more researchers involved. And so that's been looking at 10 or so different sites in different parts of Africa. And I've also done my own work there. I speak some Chichewa, which is an East African language. So that's been my experience. I have another line of work that looks more at comparisons between Asia and the US, usually with a 2-country perspective. And so, yeah, a number of countries and collaborations. I think I've done about 10 of these projects, usually with just a couple countries that are part of the comparison set. And my role in the studies is usually planning the project. So I've been first or second author on most of these things. And I'm usually contributing as a second author to trying to get all of the people to work together for some of the larger ones. And then for the smaller ones, it's more just planning what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, and a lot of back translation checking, which is always a big part of linguistic cross studies.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We had lots of stuff about language that we can discuss. And finally, we have Shilaan.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Shilaan. I'm a PhD student in organizational behavior at Stanford. I've been involved in several multi-country replications, mostly in the field of social psychology and judgment and decision-making. So that includes projects on, backlash against women who express anger, prime to behavior effects, and those kinds of projects. For one of these, we were interested in the relationship between religiosity and well-being among over 10,000 participants, I would say, across 24 countries in Asia, Europe, and North and South America, the Middle East, and North Africa. And my personal role in these replications so far has mainly just been replicator, and for one of them, lead author. But I'm currently also planning to coordinate one of these big team science projects in the future on effort gains and losses in teams. I'm also involved in a review of the replications literature, just like a meta-analytic review of where are replications published, what are they like, what are the comments on them, etc. And then a project in which I studied the perceived rigor of crowd science among research consumers.
Cool. Thanks everyone for your introductions. I think that really gives a lot of background to where your perspectives and where you come from. And I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Shaakya. I'm a JRP Scientific Affairs Officer and also a PhD candidate at Trinity College Dublin. And I study shame and child sexual abuse. And I haven't been involved in large-scale replications, but I'm currently doing a scale validation of a shame and trauma scale, and I hope to do that cross-culturally as well, so it'd be interesting to hear your experiences. Okay, so to start out, I just kind of wanted to ask each of you if you could talk a bit about the criteria that you or your PIs use to determine what studies you wanted to replicate or what theories you wanted to test on a large scale. Yeah, just kind of any criteria that went into your decision-making process would be interesting to hear about, however kind of small or trivial it may be. So yeah, I'm not sure. I guess we can start off with Savannah again.
Awesome. Yeah, so I will talk more about like how the PSA does things because that's most of the studies that I have done. So the Psychological Science Accelerator does a call for studies. And so it's more of like the topic doesn't really drive the actual capacity for the study, but more that somebody wants to do the study in our consortium. And so what happens is once people give us their ideas, we will go through and check the feasibility, the quality of the ideas, so whether it's like interesting, if it's something that's feasible for our labs around the world, if it's even something that would actually need our network to do it in. So some studies are not going to actually get any impact from being worldwide. And so we want to make sure that our actual network wants to do the study. So it goes through a whole process of it goes to the director will blind the submissions. From there, it'll go to a couple reviewers. So most of them are going to be people who are experts in that field. And that from then we'll say like whether or not that sounds interesting, if there's any things that are going to be difficult with this study. And then our study selection committee will go over that and check whether or not it's feasible. And if it is, then we accept or reject. And then our director will send feedback on whether or not that study is something that we're interested in. And then from there, it does a whole process of like what it actually will need to get up and going. Yeah, so that's kind of how studies become into our network as PSA.
And I was wondering if you could go a bit more into detail about what you consider when deciding the feasibility of the study.
Yeah. So some of the things is whether or not it's cost effective. So a lot of our labs don't actually have all of the things that they need to do big studies. So if it's going to need stuff to do like EEGs, it might not be something that our network can do. So cost effective is for sure a big thing. Another thing is like, does it have any ethic concerns? And will that actually be something we can do in our network with other IRBs coming from different countries? Ethics is one of the bigger things that plays into our studies. And then we also want to know, like, if it's something that actually is going to be impactful in our field. And so if it's something that's like, yeah, it could be cool, but it might not have a big impact, it might weigh less of a submission.
I see. So yeah, it seems like there's quite a like strict process of how to do things, or a protocol. Just out of curiosity, have any of the other panelists submitted something to Psychological Science Accelerator or been involved in collaborations with them?
We've actually just submitted something pretty recently. So my colleague Aarti, she and I work pretty extensively in trying to make sure that replications are done and validation studies exist, etc. And a lot of cross-cultural work happens because we're happy to obviously help collect data from the Indian subcontinent, so to speak. It's just that we, in terms of topic selection, it's kind of been top down. So when a large consortium kind of approaches us or writes an email to me or to Aarti or to one of my colleagues, it is more top down rather than collaborative in that sense. So it's the project formulation and conceptualization has kind of already been taken care of, and then they're seeking assistance for primarily data collection. However, that said, that's for like the large multi-country studies that we've been a part of. When we're working with 2 or 3 collaborators across countries, then it's more collaborative because it's also at a, well, I wouldn't say smaller scale, but definitely smaller scale in terms of the number of countries that are involved and the number of people involved as well. So, but I definitely understand Savannah's point in terms of just the feasibility of the resources that researchers have at hand, because a lot of the replications that we've been part of have been executed via Qualtrics. So we have access to Qualtrics, we have a license, etc. So the survey just has to be translated or back translated, etc., and rolled out to this population, which is in this country, essentially.
And would you be able to speak to, like, when a consortium approaches you or when researchers approach you for a collaboration, what kinds of considerations do you have about like accepting that invitation? Or
so primarily ethics, actually. I mean, that's one, and 2 is actually our own interest in the topic, because we wouldn't want to just be like collecting data and not really doing fun stuff with the data after collecting it, after the principal aim of that data collection is met. So, and definitely adherence to open science policies and practices to make sure that they're open to pre-registrations. The consortium is open to say us obviously using the data that we've collected, and if access to other data is okay, data availability, to ask different questions and to use that data after the main paper that's supposed to come out from the study is published and things like that. So we try and make we haven't documented this in a process as PSA has, of course, because our number of collaborations are much fewer as compared to PSA, but we do also consider, say, how easy or difficult it would be to get, say, ethical approval for a study like that. So as an example, there was another collaborator who got in touch with us from Australia who wanted to try and collect data from minors in India, but online. So we were trying to work through parental assent procedures and how that would look through the IRP, etc. Because we do have an internal institutional review board that is FWA compliant from the US Department of Health and Human Services. So we want to make sure that all of the studies that we collaborate on are, well, they adhere to the highest ethical standards.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely get back to the ethics question at a later stage because that's its own category. So yeah, Alex, would you like to speak on like the criteria for kind of how you decide which replications to take on?
Yeah, sure. So most of my work replicates projects in cross-cultural contexts, but it often isn't primarily about the replication, with the exception being the Mini Babies Consortium project. A lot of the projects I've worked on have been more tests of generality. So looking at a finding that's been established, usually with English speakers in the US, and then probing whether that holds in some context where we have reason to expect it might not. So most of the studies and most of the cultural comparisons are motivated by some difference, where we're asking questions of consistency and variation across cultures. So we'll see a language or a cultural context where something deviates from, well, not deviates, but at least you see variation, right, in different sort of assumptions about what might go into psychological processes. And if the study in the US that was done previously has made some assumptions that might not be universal about how human cognition works, then we'll try to push at that stuff. So usually there are sort of two competing hypotheses, one of which is this thing is fairly consistent because it's motivated by something general across people and societies. And the competing one will say, oh, we think this particular driving feature of variation might motivate differences here. And so we'll try to find a test population where that seems likely to work out, right? Where there's clearly variation and where it's a strong test of the generality of whatever claim we're interested in. And that way it's sort of win-win, right? If we find consistency, it's interesting consistency in a place where we might not have anticipated it. And if we find variation, then that's interesting too, and we can look into the mechanisms of that. So many of my studies have worked that way, often motivated by linguistic diversity, but sometimes by cultural diversity as well. So comparing, for instance, sort of canonical East Asian cultures to Western cultures, and how that might have implications for early cognitive development, the sorts of things kids attend to and infer in ambiguous situations. And then in the case of the Mini Babies Consortium, this is very similar to the process Savannah was describing, where individuals will pitch projects and say, this is a really important assumption that seemingly general across developmental psychology. Let's actually test this in a context with a lot more variation than the standard sample. And in that case, there's a board of folks who help weigh in on which projects to do. And then a call will go out for collaborators who are interested in that project. And usually I've come in a little bit later in the projects to help organize collaborators or find additional collaborators. So in the case of this consortium study in Africa, we immediately got a few emails from folks in different countries in Africa. And then it took quite a while to populate additional sites to get decent coverage. For instance, we had 6 sites right now, all in Kenya, and then 1 site in the other 8 countries that we're looking at. And so just trying to even out a little bit, sometimes you'll find that there are clusters of researchers in one world area, and that if you want better representation, you kind of have to go and knock on doors and check contacts. So that's been my job in some of these cases too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting, the perspective of testing generality rather than trying to replicate the findings in different cultures or different kind of populations. Yeah, I mean, that came up in the previous panel as well, in terms of like, what's the perspective that you go into with these large scale replications, and kind of like what the goal is. Like, do you really want to kind of see whether a theory holds in a certain population, or yeah, that kind of like what the goal is also an important part of designing a replication or a test of generality kind of study. Shilaan, maybe you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, one thing in terms of study selection that I've seen among colleagues as well is that it's not always necessarily the topic that inspires the multi-country approach. Sometimes it's the other way around. So it can be the method or the approach that inspires the topic. Of course, many of us since the replication crisis have been wondering how robust our research literature really is and to what extent effect sizes are variable. And these crowd science projects or big team science projects in part allow us to estimate some of this inherent variability in effect sizes. So I think that for some of these big team scientists, the interest in the method actually inspired the search for a suitable topic area that could benefit from a quantification of this variability. But in terms of criteria to determine which studies to replicate, I can think of many. I see like Gilad is, for instance, also on this call. And what attracted me to his mass replication project was the focus on some of these highly cited classics in judgment and decision making, which really helps us revisit the research findings we tend to take for granted and reestablish the foundations on which we build our research. But of course, related to what Savannah said about cost effectiveness, resources are limited, and we cannot replicate every single study that has ever been done, nor what we want to. So there's a really interesting line of work there that lays out a decision model for replication study selection under these constraints, and that can help future replicators to decide what to replicate if they want to maximize the utility gained by conducting replications. And so there's one really interesting preprint by Peter Isager and his co-authors that argues that we can make these decisions based on the replication value of the scientific claims we consider for replication, which is determined partly by one, how valuable is it to be relatively certain about this claim, and two, how uncertain are we currently about this claim. And so I try to keep criteria like that in the back of my mind when I make these decisions.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe like send us that preprint or the name of that after the panel. That would be interesting to read.
Sure.
Finally, Eduardo, I was also wondering, maybe Eduardo, if you could talk about your experience with psychometrics and in relation to what Alex said earlier about kind of deciding or kind of going into a study hypothesizing that the psychometrics may not hold, or like the scale might not be valid in a certain population versus going in with the goal of like replicating.
I was just listening to Alex, and I was just like thinking how right he was. Because, you know, I coming from psychometrics, basically when you have a scale and you wanted to validate it in several countries, basically what you are hoping for is to find no variation across the countries, because that way your scale is invariant, it works the same everywhere, and you are kind of really happy and excited for it. Because if not, you need to start tweaking your scale, and you need to start doing some other, you need to compensate for that, so to say. But the reality is, like, to me, what I learned from actually this kind of replications is that the other view, the opposite view, is quite more interesting in a sense that, okay, I'm trying to replicate that phenomenon. I'm not only interested in check, you know, black or white, whether it replicates or not. I'm actually interested in seeing the variability and how the variability affects actually that phenomenon itself. So for example, the replication we are conducting now, we are hoping that some kind of temporal discounting effect to be present across all countries, but we are actually not only interested on between country like variability, but also within country variability, and how the ratios of those kind of different levels affect the phenomenon that we are trying to observe. So I think that's something that my psychometrics background has highlighted, or has given me like the background to actually focus more on, is in not only see these studies as a way of saying, okay, this phenomenon is robust across all populations, across all the world, and we have some kind of this robust or solid finding in psychology. but also to see variability as a source of knowledge. Okay, what's the variability? Why do we have this variability in the first place, and what can we learn from it? So it's not a nuisance that we need to take care of. It's a source of important findings itself. And that's something that I think is something to bear in mind and something to consider when you are choosing a topic. Actually, for me, it's like when I choose a topic, I'm not only interested in seeing, okay, this topic is going to replicate or not. It's also, if I conduct this study in several countries, and if there is a possibility to learn about some type of differences between the countries, does it worth it? It's going to provide me some useful information. So in that sense, I think replication studies started as a way of obtaining strong evidence in psychology, but I see that at this point, we can go far beyond that, not only to have some strong results and some strong evidence in psychology, but also to learn and to benefit from learning from this kind of variability.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, and that variability as a source of knowledge rather than being a nuisance. In statistical terms as well, like, yeah, we can learn a lot from like why certain scales that are trying to measure certain concepts, like they may not be valid in a particular culture, but why it's not, it shouldn't be looked at as necessarily a problem with the development of the scale itself. Yeah, and now I'll just like open the floor up for all the panelists to if they have any other kind of comments on this particular question of like selecting studies to replicate and like their decision-making process, or if they want to respond to what other panelists have said. And you can do that like throughout the entire panel, by the way, just jump in.
So I feel like what Eduardo just brought up is a really nice segue into talking about adding extensions to replications, because he brought up, the going above and beyond to make sure our field gains even more knowledge. And it's not just perceived as, does this replicate or not? No, we're doing extra things that make sure that we gain knowledge as a field. And so I'd be curious to hear other people's perspectives on this, specifically on adding extensions. For one replication project I'm on, we visited a paper that argues that goals function as reference points. So if you set a goal to do 40 push-ups, but you only do 35, you will be less happy than someone who set the goal to do 30, but also ended up doing 35, right? And so we chose this study partly due to its impact and the absence of direct replication. But in addition to running this direct replication, we also ran an extension by considering something additional, like the impact of someone's decision style. And if I may be very forward here, and I'm of course very happy to hear the perspectives of other panelists. I believe it's still quite difficult to publish replication studies in psychology, and editors and reviewers will often question, to what extent did you push the needle? And extensions, I think, are one way for replicators to indicate to these editors and reviewers, look, we are not simply rehashing other people's work. We are engaging in a very active, laborious effort to not only look at the robustness of this previously reported phenomenon, but also making sure our field gains something, gets even more knowledge out of it. And so, yeah, that's something I wanted to bring up. And of course, one way to overcome this sentiment would be for replicators to, as much as possible, switch to registered reports so that we can all agree upon the theoretical value of a study before the results are in.
I think that's a great point and a really good way to make sure that you aren't just going to end up with a single non-replication, which can often be really hard to interpret, right? Especially if your task doesn't come with any sort of manipulation check. If you don't know whether you were able to execute the main independent variables and dependent variables and get decent measurements of them, it can be really hard to interpret. And I think that's where most of the pushback comes from. In addition to novelty, right? You get a lot of like, well, how do we know that your replication was a good replication attempt, that it should have worked in the first place? And I think to the extent that you can push at the original operationalization, not just the methods. It's good to have a direct replication, but it's good also to have some of this variation and look at extensions and look at alternatives, because there's a very real possibility that you're going to end up replicating either a weaker effect or not replicating at all. And then you're going to have to make sense of that. So having an idea going in of what you're going to take away if it doesn't replicate, is this about a difference in the population that you tapped? Is this about a difference in the way that the tasks were operationalized? Or do you think it's, maybe a real effect, just not one that's as robust as was originally documented? In which case, having a collection of other tasks can help you try to make that case, which has been helpful for me recently in some attempts to replicate. I did one project last year where we looked at about 6 different tasks and only replicated in a clear way one of them. And so then trying to work through and describe what might have caused the others not to replicate was difficult. And so now, as we're planning follow-ups to that, we're anticipating those sorts of things, right? So if this doesn't work out, what do we think are the main motivations? And are there ways that we can build in manipulation checks or other sanity tests to work out what could be the cause of non-replications or weaker replications than the original effect size?
Yeah, those are both very interesting points. And I want, kind of related to what Shilaan said, to what extent does the publication potential of the study factor into your decisions when deciding whether to pursue a replication?
I can take that one actually, because we've inadvertently, I would like to say inadvertently, done replication studies without really calling them that, and found, say, null effects or different effects, etc., with a primarily, say, Indian population, and found it just really tough to publish it in any kind of mainstream social psychology journal. And the interesting thing was not getting rejected on the basis of the merit of the study, but rather it was getting rejected on the basis of, but this is primarily an Indian population and it may not be that interesting to, well, the rest of us. Which is, I mean, if it were still on the merit of the study, I would have understood, but those are some of the responses that we are still at the receiving end of, where probably we'll get responses like, why don't you go to the Asian Journal of Social Psychology? They'd probably be kind of more interested in that, etc. So it's interesting when we try and do replication studies. Yes, absolutely. I take Shilaan's point completely that we must factor in extensions and try and understand why that effect was different or was null or was even more robust or anything like that. But inadvertently, it's been pretty tough even publishing inadvertent replication studies in that sense. So I don't think it factors it. We don't factor it in before we investigate because we're just too excited about the research. So we still do it. The publication bit comes a little later, where in case if it doesn't get published, we still put up a preprint and do all of that, make sure that it's pre-registered at the start, and then keep plugging away at say revisions and hope that it finds a home somewhere.
That was a very interesting experience. I remember you did mention that at your SIPS panel as well. But yeah, we'll definitely get to that issue in a couple of topics. But yeah, anyone else want to comment on publication considerations or?
I think I have a question for our panel. I think my question is adding extensions. Shilaan, you had mentioned that sometimes for publications, they want new novel ideas, but isn't that playing into publication bias? And how do we make sure that it's not? If that makes sense.
Could you clarify? How do you think that adding extensions could contribute to publication bias?
Yeah, so I'm asking because you've mentioned like sometimes we need novel ideas, and I think that novel ideas are great, but I also think that there's something important about like making sure that everything is done the same way in a replication study, but adding in different cultures and different countries. And so if we're adding in a whole bunch of different extensions, does that impact the way that we think about how it's going to get published, because we are adding in those things because we know that there are novel ideas and there'll be more, I don't know the word I'm looking for, more interesting to publishers, question mark.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So if I may comment on that, I think there are many viable approaches to replications, including direct replications, but also conceptual replications. And I wasn't necessarily advocating for adding novel ideas. I was building on what Eduardo was saying, that it would be great if you, for instance, have a follow-up study that further explores, adds a factor that could potentially explain the effect or explain the disappearance of an effect if there's a certain moderator. And it could even be a cultural moderator, like you just mentioned. It could be the fact that you find an effect doesn't replicate in a certain country, and you might want to explore a certain explanation for it. One thing I mentioned is registered reports. So I do believe that if you add these extensions and they lead to null effects, then they should be included as well. And by engaging in these projects, them as reports, you will make sure that people beforehand already decide this is a valuable addition, regardless of the findings. It would be interesting if it's a null effect too. And so hopefully that could overcome the publication bias concerns that you mentioned.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying.
Can I say something really quick? I think that sometimes you don't even need to create those new extensions, but these extensions, they come with the setting of working in a multi-country kind of framework. So for example, in our work, if you have a study conducted in the United States, we know that, for example, how some of economical conditions in the United States might affect, I don't know, a decision-making process. But when you are moving to a multi-country setting, now you have different conditions there, and those conditions can affect that kind of phenomena that you're studying. Of course, this is not applicable. You cannot apply this to more experimental settings that I know that many of you work on. But I think that sometimes even working on this kind of cultural thing, like multicultural works, opens the way to naturally incorporate this information into the studies. It is also true that I think that we also be more, friend to hardcore, pure conceptual replications in a way of, okay, this was the original idea and this is how it went. But we also, I think, should be open to see, okay, what's the possibility of this new data? And not in terms of creating something entirely new, but to take advantage of the work that we are already doing.
That actually reminds me of something that was talked about in the previous panel today, like the inadvertent kind of extensions. When someone said that like they had to change their questionnaires when they were doing their study in France, because you are not allowed to put ask about like ethnicity on those questionnaires. So that was interesting, because then you can kind of compare, like depending on the topic, you could ask the question of like, how does kind of making someone think of their ethnicity affect how they respond to the questions afterwards. So yeah, I guess that's an example of how within multi-country replication you can still have these kinds of novel like findings, questions. But yeah, just to get things moving along, I'll move on to the next topic now. So I just wanted to talk about like contacting and identifying collaborators. So in the case of PIs or people in charge of the studies, could you talk about how you approached collaborators or potential collaborators? And if you were the person being approached, how have you been approached by collaborators, and what are some kind of good or less ideal ways that people have approached you for collaborations? So yeah, I'm not sure if anyone wants to start off answering that topic. I'll just go with Alex first.
Sure, happy to jump in. So because so much of my work is really hypothesis driven and oriented around diversity, it's important to me to have somebody on the team who understands the cultural and linguistic context wherever we're working. And that should be somebody who is able to really contribute meaningfully to predictions about what's going to work out, what might be a stronger test of generality and why, and to working out theories in advance for why we might not see extensions or what sort of variation we might see, right? So there's, I think, some difficulty in a lot of cultural and linguistic comparisons in tending toward post hoc hypothesizing, right? Where you see some variation and then you're like, oh, maybe the relevant dimension is this. I think it might be that. And I think there's room for that. And that's a good thing to do. But then you need to do this follow-up study, right, to test that. And so we try to anticipate this in advance as much as we can. And I think it's good to have collaborators who've worked on whatever area it is that you're trying to test. So for me, where we think that some difference in the way people use language or some difference in the educational context or the cultural context is going to change the way people think about phenomenon X, we try to find somebody who has worked on that thing already and bring them in. So sometimes that means that the project gets motivated the reverse way, right? So I have a project recently looking at Tsimane speakers in the Bolivian Amazon, and that was motivated by the folks who were doing field work there, who said, oh, you know, there are some interesting differences about the language and the culture, and we're interested in probing cognition that might be related to that. And so the first thing we did was look at who has written about like features of the grammar or the culture that are relevant and go to them and ask questions about whether they've worked on that before. In our case, we didn't find much in the way of previous work. And so we ended up just working with people who had been in the field site before and knew something about the context. But I think in other cases, to the extent that you could bring on people who are from that cultural context, who are already working on the stuff you're working on, that's ideal. So a lot of the collaborations I have running in my lab are between, you know, two different folks from different cultural contexts. So working in China right now, I work with a grad student in my lab and also with a postbac student in a different lab who both come from different parts of China and have different perspectives on linguistic and cultural differences that might impact some of the studies we've been running. And those studies were born out of that collaboration. I was interested broadly in looking at differences between China and the US. So I sought out potential collaborators who might be interested in doing that. And we're already working on the same topic area. We had a big journal club and picked out some tasks that we wanted to replicate. So in that sense, it's always been sort of project motivated in my smaller studies. In some of the larger ones, approaching collaborators was more an issue of representation. So in this Mini Babies Consortium study, we sent out calls to like, you know, a lot of the major listservs for cognitive development and just didn't get as many responses as we'd like or as diverse responding as we would have liked. And so in this case, we used social networks to reach out. So like, you know, I was on a panel with these people, or I happen to know a researcher here who knows a researcher there. And often that's what you need to get in touch with some groups, right? So I tried cold emails to researchers who'd published on the area, and that was largely not successful. But then working through friends of friends, I was able to actually get meetings with people and sit down and have a discussion about whether they'd be interested in researching the topic and eventually bring them onto the project. So yeah, I think that's not ideal because it's not as open as we might want our invitations to collaborators to be. But I think having a combination of open invitations that maybe are not as well publicized in the places you're trying to reach, and then sort of pointed recruitment can be necessary and helpful.
Cool. And just to backtrack a little bit, for your kind of 2 to 3 country or culture comparisons, would you say that you kind of cold emailed more for those than for the Many Babies consortium, or what was your experience with that?
Yeah, Many Babies was more pointedly approaching strangers because they had knowledge of a world area or a language that was relevant. But the others were much more natural collaboration. So a lot of my cross-cultural projects have started with an honors thesis with some advanced student who's really excited and says, hey, I've read this finding and I don't think that's true where I'm from. So what if I did a study? And a lot of the first studies that I've been part of have been somebody going home over winter break and collecting a bunch of data and coming back. And then we try to sort of iteratively scale up along those sorts of dimensions. So I try to have sites and languages of interest be motivated by either previous research, like finding a paper where somebody has said, oh, X isn't true in this language. And then I'll try to find collaborators who are interested in that language and the cognitive phenomenon that I'm interested in. And then we'll pursue it from there. I'll say, well, how do you feel about this claim? And how could we best test it? So in those cases, it's almost always somebody that I knew who was working in that area and who might have had some background experience with that language or the culture, whether or not they had researched it before.
Okay, cool. And now I just wanted to move to Savannah because your experience is slightly different from what you told us before. So can you tell us more about your experience of being approached by collaborators and like what are some like good strategies that people can use when doing something like that?
Yeah, so I'll also point out that Alex, we do the same thing in the PSA. So we use both like committees that reach out to people that we know or people of people. And we also use our members. We do calls to people as well. When reaching out to collaborators though, I find that one, it's very different if you add personal touches. So like when you're reaching out to somebody, you want to make sure that you're adding something like, hey, this organization has really impacted me this way kind of thing. Because most of the time it goes to spam. So because we're a large network, a lot of things will go to spam, which is not always great. It's never great actually. As well as it's been very interesting in the aspect of like reaching out to people who are friends of friends and making sure you use that. So if you're reaching out to somebody who's a friend of a friend, maybe even have that friend reach out to them and give them your contact information. I find that is typically more like it's easier to get people to respond if you do that. Yeah, that's kind of been my feedback on how to reach out to collaborators. But as the PSA, we have a members network. And so once you sign up, you get information from each of the members of like, hey, I'm an expert in this. I can translate in this kind of different languages. And so we really use those resources as much as we can. And then we also give funding to people if they need funding to help us translate.
Okay. Hansika, would you like to
Sure. So when we get approached, which is I think 60 to 70% of the time, it's usually just a cold email, honestly, and it's probably referring to some of the work that we've done earlier or the fact that we do have access to like strong participant pools in India in our network of say Indian colleges, universities, and just the student base. And sometimes in the emails also they may specifically write that we're not looking for student samples, or we're looking for this specialized sample, say working population, or as I said, minors, adolescents, etc. So would you still be able to assist with that? Or that's actually really helpful, because that obviously sets the stage for understanding what kind of sample requirements we're looking at the data collection stage, as well as what the real idea of the project is. It's normally just an introductory email, and it's probably like rerouting us to, say, a Google document with the research proposal or some pre-registrations that have been done. Or I know that sometimes when emails come in, they also attach the ethics approval from their local kind of ethics agency to just tell us that, hey, this has already been vetted by another university, and now we're trying to reach out to as many collaborators as we want. And in other cases, we actually kind of opt in. So in the case of many labs, especially because of well, COVID-19, etc., it became kind of really easy for us in low resource environments to hop on board with a lot of these replications, because they were just being done, say, online. And all that we needed to do is push the survey through our networks to make sure that adequate data and good data was being collected. And I mean, in India, we don't have stuff like MTurk or Prolific or anything like that. So it's literally based on kind of gunzo networks of students and colleges that we have here. So that's something that we're pretty proficient in now. And considering COVID-19 had taken possibly every study online, especially in psychology, it became pretty easy for us to start collaborating and opting in for these larger projects and saying that, okay, we can at least assist with data collection. And then that gives us a large data set to kind of do our own further research with as well. So, and in the case of like smaller studies, I think what Alex was mentioning, it's exactly that. We possibly just reach out to someone and say that, okay, this is what we found in India. We know that it's kind of opposed to what's happening, say, in weird countries. Would you like to collaborate and try and figure out why? And usually the response is pretty positive. So, and I know that there are a lot of takers for cross-cultural work rather than just, well, India-centric work. So that's the direction that we're going in now.
Cool, thanks. It's nice to hear about the experience from someone who is normally approached for collaborations as well. Shilaan, would you like to elaborate?
Sure. So more and more what I've been seeing is open calls for replicators on Twitter, through listservs and blogs and on websites like that one of the one of the PSA. So it was really interesting to learn from everyone what to do, how organizers may continue when those open calls don't necessarily get enough response. I really appreciate that Savannah brought up funding. I think this very strongly impacts the ability to involve contributors from underrepresented countries and institutions. So if replicators are expected to shoulder the cost of data collection at their replication sites by themselves, then you might see, of course, less involvement in underfunded academic communities. And the PSA is actually the only replication organizer that I've seen actively guard against this by providing opportunities for funding, which is something I'd love to learn more about, and I'm sure Savannah can speak to more than I can. And of course, would love to hear other thoughts from the group on disability and how to involve contributors from underrepresented countries and institutions.
Cool. Finally, Eduardo, if you'd like to chime in on this.
I have to say that as a person who will often run the stats part, I'm actually like I'm the approach one, not the one to approach. But yeah, I've been involved in this kind of things, finding collaborators. I think for us, my largest replication have been conducted through JRP, which is a really large network of students and people really motivated and eager to collaborate. So it is easy to make a call for collaborators and then just to have a few dozen of people just contacting you, getting back to you. But I think at some point you need to find the people by yourself, like you directly need to colleagues, particularly in countries which are not that often represented in this kind of programs, and just try your best to find someone there. Yeah, and of course, sometimes you need to bear the cost of data collection. You need to help people there because it's particularly burdensome for maybe for them to conduct these kind of studies. But I think at the end is it is also the ability to find good collaborators in terms of that the person is going to be involved, that the person is going to be engaged, that they are not going to drop out of the project in the middle of it, or they are not going to provide low quality data, which is something that can happen and happens. And you need to be prepared, you need to find collaborators that you kind of sense that are going to be reliable, or that you see through the evolution of the project that are being reliable. And also at some point just to see, like, if I need data from this country or this region, I just need to contact many people and find it myself, because there is no other way of accessing it.
Yeah, I think we can continue the discussion of collaborating, but this time moving on to a larger topic of how we can involve non-weird or underrepresented populations in both the as researchers and collaborators, and in terms of collecting data from those populations. So if you could just elaborate on your own experience in doing so in non-weird underrepresented populations, and also if you have tips for how to go about successfully collaborating with researchers in these kinds of underrepresented areas of the world. And if you have experience in Hansika's case, for example, being a researcher in a non-weird or underrepresented population, what are some like do's and don'ts of like collaboration, and what would you like to see improved in like, yeah, in that aspect. So yeah, maybe Savannah can go first again.
Happy to. Yeah, so I actually think this is still a weakness with the PSA. Most of the people that we have as collaborators that are non-weird are actually part of our translation, which is not always great. They're still getting involved, but for example, in our PSA COVID rapid study that we just did, we actually got 33 countries that had more than 200 participants, which is a pretty big deal. But still, out of the 87 countries, to not get all of them to have over 200 participants is not ideal. So it's still something we're working on a lot. But we have a committee that is explicitly working on recruiting people. And so one of the things that we're actually doing right now is we're emailing a whole bunch of different researchers in each country that is underrepresented in our membership website, and asking them, one, if they're even interested, giving them kind of like a list of things that we do, ways that they can get involved, how this will help their career, that kind of thing. And like we've mentioned before, sometimes we even have funding, which isn't always a thing because funding is still one of our weaknesses as well. But for sure, it has been helpful when we are able to give funding to people who explicitly need it, and it will help us be more represented in each of our projects. Yeah, so I think that's the ways that currently we've been working on making non-weird populations more robust in our studies.
Cool. Maybe Alex?
Yeah, sure. So in my experience, lowering the barrier to participation, and especially to true participation, like collaborator authorship level contributions, not just data collection, is what's really key in getting collaborators excited and bringing them on board as like a full member of the team. And so the main thing that I think is helpful is looking for people who are already in this area, right? Who have some connection to the research you're doing. It doesn't have to be that they're working on exactly the same questions, but they should at least be working with these populations, with these methods, with an interest in, generality of phenomena. This should fit into their research program in some way. And so finding folks who are in some way your, match in different cultural contexts can be really helpful. You don't want to take somebody who's working on something totally different, be like, hey, you want to work on this thing? Because then the question of like incentive becomes problematic, right? Like, how are you making this valuable for them if this isn't their research program, if this isn't the sort of thing that they already have an IRB in place for, that they're already working on? And I think there are always concerns about motivations and barriers, right? So you wouldn't want to approach a collaborator who doesn't have the resources to usefully contribute to this thing in a way that's going to pay off for them and ask them to collaborate, because there are situations, right, where having a big name or ties to a given university or a program that's well known could create, you know, an incentive structure that's not ultimately good for these collaborators, right? Who are like, oh, I want to work with you. I want to have this contact. This is valuable to me, even though the study itself might not be. And I think avoiding those sorts of sticky situations is really important. So to the extent that projects can include funding, can anticipate what the barriers are going to be for those collaborators and try to address them directly, that's really important. The Mini Babies Consortium was lucky to get some funding to do this for the Mini Babies replication we're running in a bunch of sites in Africa right now. And one thing that we did was find researchers initially who were just interested in doing this, who didn't necessarily work on it already. So we're looking at a really basic question about infant language learning. And most of the collaborators we were able to find who were interested in doing a large multi-site replication were working on much more applied aspects of childhood development, things that had to do with like health and public policy, and hadn't necessarily done basic language research. And so we started by having a training that we hosted in Nairobi, and we flew everybody in. We got funding to bring them there and train them on the methods that they hadn't worked with before, to also buy anything that they needed at their site in order to run the study that they didn't already have. And I think that was really helpful because there were lots of folks who had done plenty of child development research, but not necessarily with the same sorts of tools that we were using, not with, you know, eye tracking measures or looking time measures. And so figuring out who was interested in moving into this space broadly for their own purposes, and then helping them sort of get there, right? Like run an initial pilot study that was built on other stuff, so that they're not entering into it like totally blind. So I think providing that training for folks who haven't necessarily worked on exactly the methods you're using or the populations you're using, so that they're coming into a real collaboration that feels more like a lab, the way that a lot of grad students come into a lab and learn from people who've been doing this thing. If you're asking a collaborator to step into a new area, I think it's important that you give them some training, some foothold to do the kind of work that you're asking them to do. And for that reason, to the extent that I don't have funding for this, I mostly look for people that are like my counterpart, that are already working on this thing, that already have the methods down, that are already getting the same sort of incentive structures that I'm getting, right? Like when I collaborate with other folks, it's usually the case that I'm funding that research in the same way I'm funding my other research, because it's on the same topic that a more general grant in the lab covers. And so I think looking for folks who already likely have some funding or some IRB approval to work in those areas can be another way to just reduce the barriers to entry, so that folks who do want to collaborate are better able to get something out of it.
That's interesting that you bring up incentivizing the collaborators. And I just thought of also ways that we can incentivize Western researchers or researchers based in Western, traditionally more resourced institutions to go out and seek out collaborators and populations from underrepresented populations as well. Because I mean, in your case, Alex, a lot of your research is inherently like, it lends itself to cross-cultural research, and like you need to have people from different cultures and who speak different languages, etc. But for topics that like are not inherently like that, that can be done in like single populations and answer some sort of hypothesis, there may need to be like better incentives for researchers in those areas to go and do that research in other populations as well, maybe. So yeah, just kind of that popped into my head.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think one thing that I didn't realize when I first started working across cultures was that the incentive structure can really vary, right? For me, it's publication, and that's what I'm getting out of most things. But there are lots of places where publications are not the main way that faculty are hired and promoted. And so if you're trying to work with some faculty collaborator who is not necessarily getting that much out of the paper itself, then you need to make sure that they're getting whatever they need out of this project that would be more in line with the way that they normally decide to take on a project.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, like, money always comes into this as well. Like, do you get like additional funding or like increased travel funding if you pursue this research in additional populations as well, to kind of lower the burden that a researcher might have to shoulder? But even in like my personal case of doing a scale validation, I feel like, I'm a PhD student, so like we don't really have any funding to speak of anyway. But like, I'm not in any way incentivized to collect data in populations other than an Irish population by my PIs. To be very frank, like, it's considered kind of like an additional like bonus if I do collect data from like, my plan is to do it in an Indian population and like another like immigrant population in another country. But like, it's never been seen as like the main focus of my project by my PIs, even though I see it as like one of the main focuses. And so, yeah, it's like I'm not really being pushed to go into other populations and do a scale validation, even, which, as we discussed before, like definitely will not be valid in vastly different cultures. So like, it's a bit disappointing to kind of experience that. But yeah, just another point to think about. Maybe you can move on to Hansika and your experience with being in a non-weird setting.
Sure. So I think like a caveat that I want to mention right at the start is, yes, we primarily do research in India. It is branded as a non-weird population, but you must know that I live in one of the biggest metropolitans in the country, and like a lot of the people who participate in our studies are netizens. They have access to the internet. They are English speaking or Hindi speaking at best, and they aren't necessarily very different from, say, weird populations. Yes, there are some fundamental differences, cultural differences that would be there, but I think even after, say, collecting data in India per se, we're kind of just collecting data from Mumbai, and that's very, very similar to, say, New York or any other place that's super developed and things like that. So I think I also want to caveat this with, I think at SIPS there was this other really good session on like, do categories like global north, global south help, weird, non-weird? And honestly, they don't, because we actually are looking at each of these things along a continuum, and the diversity that exists within India is the diversity that exists in the EU, for instance. And the point of, say, collaborating with someone like me as well is that there are constraints that, say, I'm operating under, and there's obviously constraints in terms of, say, the people that I can access, and sure, they may be Indian undergraduate students, but at the end of the day, they're undergraduate students. So it isn't really pushing the limits as much as we want. And one of the reasons why we actually can't possibly reach out to, say, more general populations per se is a lack of funding. So we don't incentivize our participants unless we actually get, say, some external funding from replication, collaborator, etc. So it does become a little strange in the sense of, when we say that there are all of these countries that we're collecting data from, what are the profiles of these individuals? Because if we're just expanding the understanding of human beings from US sophomores to, well, all sophomores across the world, we aren't really pushing the boundaries very much. That said, obviously, whenever I am approached with a collaboration, we're more than happy to do that. But we do caveat like all of these things in terms of like diversity and in terms of the populations that we can feasibly access. Because as I said, we don't have like prolific or MTurk or something like that. We don't have very good participant pool structures at the university level or at the collegiate level here as well. So what Pragyoshala tries to do is like work through our internal networks of professors as well as students. But that's where it's a little limiting as well, I guess.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the similarities in the populations and kind of usefulness of weird as like a geographical marker as well, because obviously like so many populations can be, you know, weird within so-called non-weird countries as well. But yeah, I have noticed like a lot of articles will, you know, do like a cross-cultural study, but like with highly educated, really well-off people in like developing countries or like global south countries, and like find the same, like we'll replicate the findings of like a previous study in a weird country, but you know, it's not, is it truly like cross-cultural, or are the cultures that you're studying in these two countries like just very similar? So that's an interesting topic. And I was just kind of wondering, like, if you had any like ideas about what kinds of structures would need to be in place for you to access like a more general population or more like not as connected populations. Like what would you need as a researcher to do that?
I think it's primarily just incentives, and not even to us as an organization or to me as a researcher, but to the participants, because as there isn't a very strong culture of being a research participant in India. Like we're not used to it. It doesn't have, it has started happening, of course, in university settings and in colleges and things like that, but it's still not very well understood. Like, what does it mean to contribute to science? What does it mean to contribute to research? And therefore, I wouldn't say that there would be more convincing required, but if there's a monetary incentive with that, even if it's a raffle or a lucky draw or something like that, where there are X number of vouchers or gift vouchers that are available up for grabs, that would even help, because we would be able to push the survey out to more general populations on social media, as well as other non-student networks, to kind of get more people interested and therefore give authentic data in that sense.
Okay. Eduardo, would you like to comment on this topic?
Again, I see these issues has an opportunity, like I said before. When you, for example, like in Spain, we always have access, or when we run this kind of studies, we always look to South America, to Latin America, and the Caribbean countries, because most of them share our language more or less. So we can do quick translation. We can speak with researchers and teams of researchers there really quickly, and we have vast connections with them. So it's easy access for us. And then, yeah, if you go to Mexico and you want to run a study there, for example, like a scale validation or some kind of, you want to replicate some finding. Yeah, if you go to Mexico City and you find highly educated people, our results are going to be similar if you come here to Madrid and you pick, again, highly educated people. But the thing is, like, what that represents to me is an opportunity when you are looking at the data to check the extent that it is the country level or the cultural level, or is it like the most individual factors, the ones that explain that kind of variance and explain that kind of variability. And I think we are doing a poor job on that. And let me explain that. We often take this kind of with these kind of variables has something that we need to control for, and you read this in all the papers. So we check the relationship between this and that, controlling for these 1,000 million things. And there is a missing opportunity there, because of course, if you are getting a skewed sample, you are getting a sample, for example, where minorities of the country are not really well represented, or non-urban people are not really well represented there. And you have only access to a few individuals. You can actually get the information from those few individuals and observe whether patterns look similar or not, or you can actually explore that, or you can highlight in your studies that, okay, we went to India and to get this data, but be aware that the demographics of this data are actually quite similar to these folks in New York. And I think we are doing a poor job giving this message, because I think it's not that it invalidates our results, but that we need to make that message more clear, just to highlight that we need to make a better job on that area. It's not something that to criticize all the studies that have been published or will be published with this kind of highly educated, non-weird samples, but it's something that we need to bring out, and we need to say, okay, few of these studies will need to be conducted in the future, doing a better job in terms of the representation in the sample, and getting a better access in the sample, even if it's at local level. And I think that's a message that needs to be out there, because there's an opportunity for doing great research, finding this kind of samples, at least until we get funded. Because of course, if you take, for example, like the World Happiness Report or the Gallup survey, yeah, you get access to representative national sample weighted by every single measure that you want to try. But who has the money for that? I mean, like only these few corporations. And until we reach that point, I think it's our message as researchers to put an asterisk in, or at least to highlight that we need to do a better job on that as a community, as a research community.
Yeah, totally agree. It reminds me of this paper I saw doing this literature review on my current topic, but it was again collected in Delhi in India, and all it said about that population was that it was like a adolescent school population, but it didn't mention like what the kind of sociodemographic makeup of that area of the city is like, because it could be like a very well-to-do area, and that would completely change the interpretations that you could make from the data as well. So yeah, definitely describing the populations in more detail and the similarities or differences between them. We need to do a better job of that. And finally, Shilaan, sorry to take so long to get to you, but yeah.
No problem at all. I think it's actually very apt, because I haven't had any active experience recruiting collaborators, so I don't think I can speak to this topic as much as everyone else has, but it was very interesting to learn from everyone.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I wish we could go on with this topic for forever. Maybe we'll have like a different panel on the specific topic. But to keep things moving, since a lot of you mentioned that you are involved in kind of translation of scales and like back translation, would you be able to elaborate on like the process you use to do that? If there is like a kind of a gold standard that you use, or you found that something is better than the standard kind of back translation method that people tend to use, etc. Maybe Savannah, since you mentioned translation as well.
Yeah, so the PSA has an official process for translation. So what happens is that we get two translators. The first one will translate the original document into the language that we are translating it into. And then the second translator will back translate it. And then from there, they talk and discuss to see if there's any discrepancies that have happened and find solutions to those discrepancies, which then like makes it into like the third version. And then from there, we do external readings. So we have people who are non-academic, but also fluent in the language, read over the document and say, this is how I've understood it. This is how I perceive this question to And if there's any kinds of like misunderstandings happening or just words that just are just way out of the line, we'll go back to like discussing and try to find a solution to that. And then from there, we do a cultural adjustment. So like some words just mean very different things in each culture. So we read over and find any of those and then adjust based on the lab. So the lab itself will do that. So if you sent the document to me, my lab would be like, well, student means this and not this. And if adjustments need made, they'll go to the language coordinator, which every study has a language coordinator. So that's like our official process of doing translations, which has mostly worked. There are definitely some complications with discussion because sometimes people just really cannot find a solution. But luckily we have a language coordinator that kind of has that median and can moderate those discussions. But yeah.
That's very cool that you have a language coordinator for all of your studies. Yeah. Alex, would you like to elaborate on your experience with this?
Sure, yeah. Mine has been very variable. So I have a background in linguistics, and I have done back translations through coursework and thought about interlinear glossing, which is sort of the gold standard in linguistics for trying to understand how both form and meaning contribute to the overall interpretation of a sentence. So often in linguistics papers, when people are giving examples, they'll give the sentence in the target language, and then they'll give an interlinear gloss, which takes each morpheme, each unit of meaning, and just gives the literal translation of that thing, even though it's going to break often the syntax of the sentence and sometimes the pragmatics of the sentence. And then you have the third line, which is the, coherent translation into the other language. So for instance, I work with Chichewa, which is a Bantu language, and you could say a sentence like Kamandi Dutsa Dutsa, and the units of meaning there are like diminutive, regular tense, me, crosses, crosses. That would be the interlinear gloss. And then the actual English gloss would be, she crosses my mind all the time. And so you can see how the language is accomplishing things a little bit differently, right? Like crosses, crosses is using reduplication, where you get this repeating meaning as a result of repeating the word. English does use reduplication, but not for this type of sentence. And so understanding not only how you're conveying, like what you're conveying, but how you're conveying it, I think can be important, especially for really close translations of experimental prompts. So this mostly comes up for me in developmental studies with young children, where we're trying to translate a prompt in a way that we think is going to be interpreted similarly by, say, another 4-year-old, which can be really difficult because knowing the words that most 4-year-olds know is already a research program in itself. And trying to understand that and prepare your materials accordingly can be really difficult. So we use a lot of different processes. We do the same sort of gold standard translation, back translation by independent folks. So the person doing the back translation has generally not seen the original materials, they're blind to them. And then we always have a team of folks, including both the translators and a native English speaker, since English is almost always the source language, where the native English speaker will say, well, here's the thing that strikes me as different between the original line and the back translation, right? Like this is the connotative difference, or this is the denotative difference between these terms. Here's how I'm understanding the scope of this quantifier in a different way, whatever. And then we'll work through, well, what are the possible translation targets in the language that could get this meaning? And is there something that's closer to that English key term that we wanted to hit? We mostly have these longer conversations about quantifiers or other types of scalars. So like how frequently people do things, how much they like them, that sort of stuff can be notoriously difficult to translate because you end up with just sort of different scope in different languages. So we spend a lot of time on that. For scales like Likert scales, we'll look for previously published versions so that we're not reinventing the wheel if somebody's already solved how to say, this is the thing I most agree with in a given language. And then the other thing we do is try to keep track of when we're translating for what sort of goal, right? So is it just important that we're conveying the same meaning and the individual words and the sentence structure and order don't matter? Or is it the case that we want a really close translation where we're roughly mentioning things in the same order, which might take some rearranging if you have a different canonical sentence order in the language that you're working with. So setting out goals, I think, is a big part of it for me going in. Is like, what is the goal? What are the things that we think we're most likely to mess up on? And how are we going to check those particularly?
That's so fascinating. It's great to have you on this panel because it's such a detailed explanation of the translation process. I wish we had like a linguist on every study to help with that as a language coordinator. But yeah, I guess Eduardo, could you chime in if you have experience with this area?
I think that with translations, I think in our studies, we have always followed the same kind of, a little bit like the same kind of version. And to me, the biggest challenge actually with this kind of translations is not when you need to translate the scale, but in our case is that there are experimental settings, but also with a lot of demographic variables is when you need to adapt those questions. For example, like you have education level, or you have these kind of things, and then you need to find the proper standards, for example, from UN or UNESCO or something like this. But sometimes you feel that those are someone from the local country tells you that those are not going to be really well understood, and then you need to adapt those. And then, for example, given my background in statistics, you are thinking this is going to be a pain later on when I need to put everything like in a common language, because you need to find the common ground in order to check the data. So I think in those kind of, I think that's one of the parts where transparency must be total, complete, because you are doing a lot of decisions that are specific to a given country, that if you don't keep a really thorough track of those decisions, they can be lost because they are maybe done like in a couple of emails or in a day, or you make your best choice. And then those small details are lost maybe like in the final paper, so are not really well reflected. And a lot of times I found myself, when you take materials from a study to make a replication or to try to understand what's going on, that those small parts are missing. And that's I think one of the places where the degrees of freedom of the researcher can open, can be a little bit, you can feel a little bit more free to make some calls, and you need to make sure that what you are doing makes sense. And it will only make sense if you have good collaborators in those local countries that are also giving you like the best suggestions in order to adapt those things. So yeah, in terms of translation, I don't have that much experience, but in terms of adapting the questionnaires and adapting the experiments, sometimes you need to be really cautious about the decisions that you make and make sure that you register every single decision that deviates the original materials from the ones that you're going to be applying in that particular country or scenario.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. It's like, I guess it's like annotating code as well. Like, I know I've forgotten a lot of decisions like relating to translating scales and general life decisions as well. But, you know, yeah, so it's a really good point in actually like talking about the researcher's personal like process of documenting these things and then making that documentation available to the public as kind of like an open science initiative too. Yeah, Shilaan, do you have experience in this area?
I do not, so that's something I cannot speak to.
Okay, do you have any questions for our panelists before I move on to Hansika?
No, I think that was very clear. I learned so much, especially Alex, all the terms you were using. I'm gonna have to use my dictionary afterwards. It was very intriguing, yeah.
Cool. So yeah, Hansika, what has your experience with helping translate materials been?
I think my response is actually a combination of Savannah and Eduardo's, because we do follow the gold standard translation, back translation by independent translators, and then any kind of disputes are resolved together, and to make sure that the understanding of terms like getting mad at someone, which is not colloquially used in say India, where getting mad at someone does not translate into getting angry at someone. Getting mad at someone literally translates into, well, being crazy at someone, which doesn't make sense in our context. Things like that are like cleared out. But also the adaptation is so very important, because that's something that we've actually worked with even say multi-country places, etc., to tell them that the demographics that you're using are just not going to make sense in India, because race is not that big a deal here. Caste is more important. Religious identification is more important, and things like that. So we do help adapt, and even things like, say, if we want to understand what their annual family income is, or their annual personal income is post-tax, then we give slabs related to Indian rupees versus, say, USD, because people don't generally convert to that in Indian currency, etc. So we do kind of a combination of both the things that Savannah and Eduardo were mentioning.
And a related question, like, how do you choose which language to adapt a scale into? I mean, I assume it's largely based on the population that you'll be targeting, but even like within a college student population, how would you decide between like English or Hindi or another local language?
Absolutely. I think so majority of the translations that we've done are in the other official language of the country, which is Hindi. But more specific language translations have been done into local regional languages, say Tamil and Marathi and things like that, because India is very diverse linguistically, etc. So it really depends on the kind of population that we're targeting. But if we had to do one, if we had to translate to increase the spread of the population that we could reach, it would be in.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was really curious to know what that would be like. And just out of my own curiosity, like, have you done a lot of studies in other regions of India as well, in addition to Mumbai?
We have. We've done a field experiment in Tamil Nadu, where we had to translate all of our recruitment and experimental materials into the local language Tamil, and I don't speak Tamil, or nobody on the team was speaking that language. So we did get local research assistants to help us with coordinating with participants there, because they were villagers actually, and they were a rural population. We have done another study in, if I understand correctly, as part of many labs, we did do a Bengali translation as well of the survey documentation, and Orissa. So we did translate stuff into Odia. But right now, I'm not as part of multi-country collaboration, but within India, we're doing a large-scale project on the impact of COVID-19 on Indian STEM scientists, and we've translated that in 10 regional languages.
Oh, wow.
So it's English plus 10 languages. So that should be really interesting in terms of the populations that we can reach out to.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I can't wait to continue that conversation with you another time. But we are kind of running out of time. So I just want to get to two important topics, ethics and dissemination. So firstly, what were some of like the ethical considerations that you had to take in these large scale replications? You could talk about some of the challenges you faced in that regard, and also if you have any recommendations. Yeah, Savannah.
Yeah, so I am not overly involved in this, but I do have some things to add. One, we always have a committee, and so each study actually has somebody that is explicitly there for ethics purposes. But I think one of the most interesting things that we have found that to be difficult is making sure that each person has their ethics, like IRB approval, especially because some countries don't need IRB at all. Other countries have like very, very strict like rules for their IRB. And so we've done a lot of different things for each of our projects. So some of our projects we have gotten one. So for our COVID studies, because we were on such a short timeline, we got one IRB at Ashland University and just added a whole bunch of people onto it. Whereas other studies, because we've had more time and it was just easier to have everybody do their own IRB, we've done that as well. But yeah, I think that's really as much as I have to add because I'm not very much involved with that part of the process.
Okay. Shilaan?
Yeah, could I ask a question? Savannah, that was really interesting what you just said about the COVID study, the rapid study. Because the process that I've seen here is that, or the process that I've seen across the projects that I've been involved in is that the project lead tends to get IRB approval and then forwards these documents to our replication site. But then because IRB regulations differ a lot across institutions, these replicators then each have to figure out whether their internal IRB allows them to rely on the external IRB approval from the project lead or requires them to seek local approval as well. So I've seen some institutions allow reliance on a single external IRB protocol, but not all. So my university, for instance, as far as I know, here we are generally required to seek local IRB approval if any Stanford researchers are involved. So I didn't know if this ability to add a bunch of external collaborators to an IRB, and I'm very curious if to hear from other people too if they've relied on that. So far, I've always had to submit my own IRB proposal for every project I've been involved in.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has like experience with that, like the local ethics committees as well. The only thing that I can say is that like from what I've done here, we're collaborating with a clinic in Dublin, and they don't have their own ethics committee or IRB or anything, even though they do collaborate quite often. And like we got approval by having the CEO of that clinic sign off on a letter saying that their collaboration is dependent on our university's ethics approval. So as long as like I got approval from my university to conduct the study, they were okay with doing it, and then my department's ethics committee was okay with that. And then for future collaborations with like international researchers, we are required to get approval from local ethics committees where it applies. So like if they have an ethics committee at the clinic or university or whatever that I would be collaborating with internationally, I would have to get approval from them first, and then include it as an amendment or in my ethics amendment. So, yeah, so I guess it's kind of similar to what you're saying, but there seems to be kind of like some leeway in terms of like how strict it actually is, because I was just able to like get a letter from this clinic at least saying that like our university's approval was fine.
Yeah, and we also like gave people the opportunity that if they needed to get an IRB at their institute, that was totally an option. But because of time, we were just trying to get everybody onto our IRB so we could just get it up and moving. So.
Yeah, I could chime in there. We actually get local ethics approval for all projects that we're collaborating on, particularly because of things like Sophia mentioned, like if there's something culturally offensive or something that possibly we as Indian researchers would have more context of as compared to our collaborators. That's what we want to kind of protect our participants against. So we do local IRB approval for any project. And I think there was one project where someone actually approached us to just start collecting data, and they actually sent us the survey link to start distributing. And I had to very politely decline and say that, but it hasn't gotten local IRB approval. And they were actually really gracious, and they actually applied for ethics approval through our IRB so that it would all get vetted, etc. And now we can assist them in collecting the data and then future collaborations as well. So I think also, again, because the culture of, say, ethical approval is not very, very strong here, you may tack on to, say, a Western university's IRB, which is not problematic at all. It's just the context may not necessarily be there, and we don't want to inadvertently do something or offend anyone and kind of just protect people against that. So we do route everything through our IRB.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, I have found a lot of places will just rely on the bigger institutions like IRB in general. Yeah.
Yeah,
Alex
can I say?
or Eduardo?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I wanted to say something like one thing that I found that is really curious is, for example, at my home institution, if you bring, for example, an IRB from the US, they are not going to look that much to the ethics side of it because they understand that the other committee has reviewed it, so then they are fine with it, but they will look into the details of the data collection and data hosting and how the GDPR, for example, applies or not applies to them and how they are handling data. So that's something that, I don't know if it goes particularly into the ethics, but for example, my university is even more concerned in terms of the ethical and the standard approach, like how are we going to handle the data in terms of the legal consequences of US versus EU different data legal regulations, and they are really like that's something that is really curious to find that they don't care much about. I mean, they are fine with having other people looking through the ethical side of it, and they trust the other institution, but they wanted to double check what's the data, what's going to happen with the data, and whether they are going to be in trouble in terms of privacy, GDPR, or they are liable in case that something wrong happens with data.
Interesting. Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, so I think I've seen all the different options. So the intent to rely thing, you do find institutions that are prepared to do intent to rely on another institution, which is not always ideal. I think it's important in those cases to have multiple local stakeholders who are at least reviewing your experimental materials, if not doing a separate IRB approval process. But then I think more commonly in the larger sort of consortium collaborations, folks will often rely on their local IRB, since different IRBs work in very different ways, and some take much longer and some are individual project focused versus like entire lab area of research focused. So I have run into the most trouble mostly working in new countries and trying to establish what is typical for the IRB process there. Often when I have, a very motivated honor student who wants to do research in the country that they come from, it takes us quite a while to work out exactly what the requirements are legally at the government level in a new country, and also what is typical. Right. So it might be that there are very few legal requirements. Sometimes only medical research needs to be IRB approved, but IRBs exist at institutions and can approve, academic research as well that doesn't have medical implications. And so then we usually spend a lot of time trying to reach out to folks who are doing similar work and asking them what's typical for them, which resources they use, and how they decide when a study is ready to go ethically. So that can be a bit difficult. And I think the best resource there is finding folks who have done similar research and asking them what they think the gold standard is. Because often, your own institution or the journal that you're planning to publish in doesn't have a lot of specific guidance on how to do IRB outside of making sure that there is some IRB approval and intent to rely if it's not local. So that's the main issue that I've run into. I think another thing that's important is thinking about when the government sort of country level IRB restrictions and policies don't necessarily address the site that you're working at. So in cases like the Tsimane language and speaker population, this is a group of people who live in Bolivia, but they're not part of mainstream Bolivian culture in a lot of cases. And so in addition to getting country level IRB approval in Bolivia, in the US, having that intent to rely relationship set up, you also want to find the local stakeholders in the communities that you're going into and have a conversation with them about what their process is for allowing people into the community, where it's often much more salient when you're in these smaller scale communities. And making sure that people are comfortable with the way that you're approaching potential participants and the way you're interacting. And often it's important to think about what you're going to give back to communities. If you're a big presence in the community rather than like one researcher in a large city, how you're going to help. A common way that linguists will give back to communities is helping make dictionaries or word books for languages that are less well documented. And I think it's less clear how psychologists can do that, like whether it's a matter of reporting back on the findings or just having an ongoing relationship with that community. So it's not like a one and done interaction, which can be sometimes, problematic for various reasons. And also just personally not as nice for the participants who did this very strange thing that's out of the usual script and are wondering what's in it for them. So I think that's another big part of it is especially when you're working in these sort of smaller scale contexts, figuring out what beyond the IRB you can do to make sure that your research is sensitive and tailored to the community you're working with.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just about getting ethical approval, formally. It's about actually making sure that the community is comfortable with what you're doing. And that actually, your comment leads us into the final part of the discussion. I know we're a bit over time, but yeah, I guess we'll just keep this brief. But in terms of reporting back on your findings or disseminating your findings after the study is done, how have you done that for your replications, and how have you made sure that, well, if this is the case, that people in participating countries and communities were able to access your findings and articles and other sorts of materials? Shilaan, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. The projects I'm on currently have not reached dissemination stage yet, so I would love to hear from other people.
Yeah, anyone else can jump in.
I'll go ahead. So one of the things that we do is we have a select group of people that we trust to give information before our project really gets out. And so we'll set up interviews with a couple of different people. So we have a person at Vox that his name is Brian Resnick that we trust, a person at BuzzFeed, so Stephanie M. Lee, and then a person at 538, which is Christy Ashwandan, I think is how you say her name. Chris typically deals with that one. So we will sit down with them and kind of explain what happened in our study, give the lay terms so that when they publish their research based on ours, it's something that any audience is able to understand. We've also done in our most recent COVID study, Harvard actually released this video that they put on YouTube that describes everything that happens in our study in 8 minutes long. And it's just so good. And so we have people that we trust to get our information out there in ways that people will understand. And we also make sure that all of our studies are on SciArchive. Why was that so hard? To make sure that they're open resources. And yeah, I can definitely share that video with you too.
Anyone else?
So one thing that we do in my lab, because it's a developmental psychology lab, is send out newsletters to preschools and parents who've participated in the past. And that's been a nice way, I think, to think about how best to reach communities, especially communities of lay people, right, of parents who've participated with their kids and don't necessarily want to engage deeply with the science of what you're doing, but would like the short layperson summary of what you learned from testing their kid. So building on newsletters like that and sending those to whatever recruitment channels we've been working through is one good way, especially for developmental studies. It's a little less clear how to do this with adults, but usually we work with the local collaborators to figure out how they normally handle dissemination and follow their policies. Although in a lot of cases it's that they don't. So it'd be nice to find better, more general solutions, I think, for multi-country dissemination.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think Savannah's trusted journalist thing was also kind of cool. Like you just, yeah, I don't know. It's like leaking information to trusted sources. But yeah, Eduardo?
I have to say that I often leave that part of reporting to others because actually I'm not like a native speaker. So even if when I have to translate like these kind of insights, and mostly the guy who's running with the equations, if I have to translate those insights into plain English, sometimes it's even a little bit harder for me. So for my perspective is what I always do when we try to disseminate these studies is to take the perspective from other researchers, because during my career, I have taken advantage of so many open data sets in my life. Like I have been published papers with the ESS, with the World Research Survey, and with data from other peers. And I want others to take advantage of the information I have collected. Collect information is hard. It's not easy, and conduct these studies is costly in terms of effort, in terms of money, and in terms of resources. And not everyone is able to access this information. And we have to say that a lot of information is just lost in the ocean of data sets, because we often do not analyze every single aspect of it, because if not, the biggest message will be lost. And to me, that's a pity. It's a pity that, okay, I couldn't make every single, like the most of it, or I was not interested in some cases or some aspects of the data, but other people will. And what I want to make sure is that the research community can access my data or the data we have been collected, and they can analyze the data, and they can do the graphs, and they can do, like, they can have a comprehensible view of it in the more, and I can make their lives as easier as possible. So to me, when we try to analyze, we disseminate these projects, I make sure that our data is not only that you put some data files and some R scripts in OSF. Is that you create a good codebook, that the data is clean, that every single transformation you run on the data is reflected somewhere, or the code is there, that you don't have crazy variables, these kind of things that happen when you work with dozens of people and maybe like a team of 5 analysts running through the same data over and over again. So to me, that's a really important part that is really, like, people are getting better, we are getting better at it, but there is still a long road to go. And also to make sure that the message is there, that we are not only publishing this study. For example, the study we are running now, one of the objectives of the study is actually to say to people, hey, take a look to our data, because we are only analyzing some small part of it that we are interested on. But in our case, we have collected a few other things. If you are interested, have a go, go for it, like access, message me. And I think that's something that needs to be more out there. Like, we have conducted this project, but in case that you want to reanalyze, use another methods, have another look, you have easy access to it. And I think that's some really important part of disseminating or giving away parts of you, or giving your project back to the community.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Like, we've so far discussed giving back to the participants or the communities that you studied, giving back to the public, and giving back to the research community as well. And Hansika, would you like to add anything to the dissemination aspect?
I think in addition to OSF and SciArchive, I think the other thing that we do is just make a really simple infographic, like post it on all of our socials or put it on our website and send it across to several people so that it just summarizes the study. We also write popular press articles. So not that we have ins with journalists, we write the articles ourselves and then we kind of pitch it to these news media places in India, etc., to see whether someone would be interested in that angle or that piece. And we also run a non-weird blog on Psychology Today. So if we have done certain types of collaborations that we would want to kind of showcase there in terms of just a snapshot of or a layperson summary of what we did, that's another route that we disseminate.
Great, cool. Yeah, Alex, I see you have to leave. So yeah, I think we'll just wrap this up here since we're over time anyway. But I'd like to thank all of our panelists for giving their time to be here and for your contributions. This has been a really fascinating conversation and I can't wait to continue it in various ways and converse with all of you in the future. And we'll be in touch as a follow-up soon as well. So yeah, thank you. And thank you, Shilaan, also for coming despite feeling under the weather. Hope it was worth it. And Hansika, I know it's late in Mumbai, but yeah, thanks so much for coming. And thanks to all our attendees and audience as well.
Thank you so
Thanks
much
for having us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.